If I may, I'll tell you the problem with the scientific power that you're using here. It didn't require any discipline to attain it. You didn't earn the knowledge for yourselves, so you don't take any responsibility. You stood on the shoulders of geniuses to accomplish something as fast as you could, and before you even knew what you had, you patented it and packaged it and slapped it on a plastic lunchbox, and now you're selling it. You want to sell it. Well,
I don't think you're giving us our due credit. Our scientists have done things which nobody's ever done before.
yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
In 1972, Bruce Lee began working on what would turn out to be his final movie. It was called Game of Death, but after filming began, production paused on that to allow Lee to work on the movie Enter the Dragon instead. He always planned to come back and finish Game of Death once Dragon had wrapped, but he would never have the chance to do so. Bruce Lee died on the 20th of July, 1973. And this obviously left Game of Death with a problem. See, they had filmed some of the scenes involving Bruce Lee, but nowhere near enough to finish the movie as planned. Rather than shelve the project, instead what the filmmakers did was substantially rewrite the movie to work around the scenes that Lee had already filmed, but mostly they just replaced him with some really obvious body doubles, and at one point they literally just used a cardboard cutout of his face. The final movie ended up being so different from what was planned that it only actually features about 13 minutes of Lee's original performance, as well as some footage of the actor taken from other projects. Oh, and there's also a scene where Lee's character fakes his own death, which was made using real footage of Bruce Lee's actual corpse in his open-top casket funeral. Game of Death was not much of a hit when it came out, a full 5 years after Lee's death, but for better or worse, it earned its place in cinema history as the final movie starring Bruce Lee. And then, 35 years later, Johnny Walker released an advert featuring a totally CGI Bruce Lee, what we'd probably call a deepfake today. Despite apparently having the permission of his family to use the actor's likeness, the ad was heavily criticized as being disrespectful to Lee's legacy, not least because he didn't even drink any alcohol other than sake. But today, more than 10 years after that advert came out, and nearly 50 years after Bruce Lee appeared in a movie after his death, the ethics of how, when, and why a movie can use the likeness of a dead actor is a more relevant and important conversation than it ever has been. Just this year, we've seen Ian Holm's likeness from the original Alien movie reused to portray a new character in Alien Romulus. The War of the Rohirrim used archived recordings of Christopher Lee from the Hobbit movies to voice the character of Saruman. And September saw the death of James Earl Jones, who before he died gave permission for Disney to use his archive of voice acting to train an AI to replicate his performance as Darth Vader. And the icing on the cake, it was just announced that Peter Cushing will be recreated using AI for a new documentary about the Hammer horror films. Yep, they are literally reanimating the actor who played Dr. Frankenstein.
Fate, it seems, is not without a sense of irony.
Technology is becoming more and more capable of creating more and more realistic likenesses of dead actors, and yet the debate around whether or not this is ethical, or indeed legal, continues to play out in more or less the exact same way it has done since we all cast our eyes on, well, Peter Cushing in 2016. On the one hand, you have people saying that actors who have passed away should be left alone and that new actors should be given the opportunity to step into these sorts of roles. While on the other hand, you have people arguing that so long as the recreation was done with the permission of the actor's family, why shouldn't filmmakers use this technology to recreate iconic performances? But the problem with this debate is that I think it often ends up focusing on the wrong thing. We end up talking a lot about how they did it and how realistic the effect is, but that never really seems to go far enough to answer the question of why audiences were pretty fine with Paul Walker in Furious 7, but Christopher Reeve in The Flash made them very uncomfortable. Because the technology is part of that, but it's not the whole story, and that is what this video is about. But I should say up front that I'm not really going to be getting into the legal side of all of this, because while there has been the odd legal dispute over the years around the use of a dead actor's likeness, it seems that in most cases, the legal questions were all resolved between the actor's estate and the studio, and we don't really have any right to question the motives or the decisions of the people who the deceased actor trusted with their likeness. Lawyers and judges are the only ones qualified to make a call on what is and isn't legal, and besides, the laws around this sort of stuff vary wildly, both between US states and internationally. No, the focus of this video is on the ethical debate, because, well, that's subject to the court of public opinion. Because if we assume the legalities are taken care of, and given all the advancements in animation, AI, and so on, then the question is no longer one of whether or not we can recreate dead actors, it's whether or not we should.
Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
I wanted to answer that question in this video, and so to do that, I have designed a totally objective and perfectly scientific framework. It's called the Malcolm Measure of Creepiness, and it's named after both Dr. Ian Malcolm's timeless question of applying ethics to technological advancements capable of bringing dead things back to life, as well as Bruce Willis's character from The Sixth Sense, who, spoiler alert, is dead.
I see dead people.
The Malcolm Measure is a very simple test for studios and filmmakers to figure out if using a dead person's likeness in their movie is a tasteful and classy way to farewell a beloved actor, or just a soulless cash grab trying to profit off the legacy of a dead person and wring the last drops of nostalgia out of a wary audience.
The franchise rights alone will make us rich beyond our wildest dreams.
And here it is. Okay, yes, it's a lot, but let me walk you through it. The Malcolm Measure of Creepiness is a set of 7 questions designed to go beyond simply asking how a dead actor was recreated, and instead tries to understand the full context of the project that is using their likeness. It does this by looking at 4 things: how long it has been since the actor has died, whether or not the actor had played that character before, whether or not the actor themselves or their family had agreed to the project, and finally, the technology used to recreate them. The answers to these questions each award between 0 and 5 points, and after answering them all, you'll wind up with a score out of 25, the Malcolm score. The lower the Malcolm score, the less creepy and more acceptable it is to use the likeness of a dead actor in your project. Now, I could talk through the Malcolm Measure a bit more, but I think it's best if we treat this like that board game you hate and just jump straight into an example and you'll pick it up along the way.
Thought you could leave without saying goodbye.
Paul Walker died in a car crash in 2013, about halfway through filming Furious 7. After adjusting the script a bit, most of his final scenes were filmed using his brothers as stand-ins, who then had a digital version of Walker's face laid over the top of theirs. The result ended up being a pretty convincing and surprisingly emotional send-off to the actor and the character, and is generally regarded as one of the high points in the franchise. So let's figure out the Malcolm score. When the movie came out, Paul Walker had been dead for less than 2 years. He had of course played the character of Brian before, and we know that he had agreed to be in this project since he was already filming it. According to director James Wan, he had filmed about half of his scenes before he died. And finally, when we see the character of Brian on screen in the final movie, what we are looking at is a combination of Paul Walker's own performance combined with a digital version of his face overlaid on the body doubles. So we wind up with a total Malcolm score of 5, which is well within the acceptable range. A similar example to this would be Oliver Reed, who died towards the end of filming Gladiator. That gets a Malcolm score of just 2 because he had mostly finished filming all of his scenes at the time of his death, and they filmed his final one by splicing outtakes from other scenes he had already shot into the final movie with the help of a body double. So in both cases, recreating the dead actor is not very creepy because you're really just finishing a performance that they themselves had already started. If that's the situation, then I think most people agree that the best thing you can do to honour their memory is to actually finish the job and, if possible, give the actor a fitting send-off in the process. So let's move on to the next tier of creepiness, and for this we'll use Carrie Fisher's posthumous appearance in The Rise of Skywalker. Carrie Fisher died in 2016, before production had begun on episode 9. So her appearance in that movie was done mostly by using deleted scenes and other old footage of her appearance in The Force Awakens, and you definitely can't tell that the other actor's lines have been shoehorned in to fit her pre-existing dialogue.
It looks like I'm making excuses.
Don't tell me what things look like, tell me what they are.
So if we bring it to the Malcolm Measure, well, Carrie Fisher had been dead for 3 years by the time episode 9 came out. But she had of course appeared as Princess Leia before, and because she signed on for the whole sequel trilogy, she had agreed to be in The Rise of Skywalker in her lifetime. But she never actually began working on that project since she died while The Last Jedi was in post-production. But when we watch the final movie, the majority of what we are looking at is archival footage of Carrie Fisher herself, giving us a total Malcolm score of 8. A similar example is The War of the Rohirrim, which uses archive recordings of Christopher Lee from when he was filming The Hobbit to have him portray Saruman in that movie. Now, Lee has been dead for 9 years, but he had appeared as Saruman in his lifetime. But unlike Carrie Fisher signing on for the sequels, Lee did not consent to be in The War of the Rohirrim since it hadn't been developed when he passed away. But his family did give permission on his behalf, and because they are only using Lee's voice without any assistance of AI, we wind up with a total Malcolm score of 9. So these examples are still within the bounds of what's acceptable because the actor's likeness is being recreated to reprise a character that they had already played once before, but crucially, it's done using footage of that actual actor acting as that character in their lifetime. But the score is also high enough that it should make you reconsider whether or not you should actually be doing this. It's not a total no-go, but it's definitely creepier than this because you're not finishing an existing performance, you're creating a new one. And that is why it's so important to ask whether or not the actor had started working on the project in their lifetime. If they had, then you're finishing something that they had already started. But if the actor hasn't started working on it, then that should be enough to make you question whether or not it is absolutely essential to this story for you to bring back this dead actor. Or if you should try something else, like writing them out of the story like the Fast franchise did with Brian, or just recasting them like the Harry Potter series did with Dumbledore after Richard Harris passed away. In the previous examples, doing this would have been much harder because the production was already well underway when the actor died. But if you're starting from scratch, then you have a lot more flexibility to work around the actor's death. But ultimately, the reason all of these cases are at the more acceptable end of the Malcolm measure is because of how these actors were brought back to life. In all of these cases, what we ended up seeing in the final movie was some version of that actor playing that character in their lifetime. So even though the context of that performance has been changed, you are still being relatively faithful to the actor and their craft. Where that crosses a line is when you try to create a performance that the actor never gave.
Let him rest in peace, while he can.
Peter Cushing in Rogue One was the first mainstream example of a dead actor's likeness being used in this way. Not using existing footage in a different context, but actually creating a totally new appearance of the actor and the character from scratch. They did this by using an actor on set giving both a physical and voice performance, with a rig capturing that for reference. Then the actor's face was replaced by a digital version of Peter Cushing's. It's pretty similar to what they did with Paul Walker in Furious 7, but unlike Furious 7, which still had a lot of scenes of the actual Paul Walker in it, or Rise of Skywalker when we saw repurposed footage of Carrie Fisher, when we see Peter Cushing's likeness in Rogue One, his entire face is completely artificial for the whole time he is on screen. So what does that do to the Malcolm score? Well, Peter Cushing died over 20 years before this movie was made. He did appear as the character of Grand Moff Tarkin before, so that's fine, but of course, he never agreed to be in Rogue One because, again, he died 20 years before it was made. His family did agree to this though, and finally, his appearance in the movie was done by using a fully digital replica of his face. So that gives us a final Malcolm score of 14, and that is in the bracket of very creepy, definitely don't do this. But not for the reason you might think. Because a lot of people think that this is creepy because of the whole uncanny valley effect, where animations that are hyper-realistic end up feeling fake and unsettling. So the discussion ends up becoming focused on whether or not the effect was convincing, with the implication being that if it is realistic, then it's fine. And I think that's kind of missing the wood for the trees, because this technology is only going to get better over time. Like, look at Ian Holm in Alien Romulus. Personally, I thought that this was far more convincing than Tarkin, and also because the character he was playing was a literal robot zombie, it meant that the synthetic, slightly unsettlingly fake nature of the digital performance actually worked pretty well in the context of the character. But this has a Malcolm score of 11, putting it in the same creepy, don't do it bracket as Tarkin in Rogue One. The literal ghost of Harold Ramis in Ghostbusters Afterlife, which was also much more convincing than Tarkin, scores a 13. So all three examples are in the same bracket of creepiness because the Malcolm measure doesn't care about how realistic an effect is. Partly because that's subjective, but mostly it's because it's not the point that really matters in this discussion. The point that matters is not whether or not we can recreate a dead actor's likeness convincingly, it's whether or not we should. And I for one think that if your project scores this highly on the Malcolm measure, then you shouldn't, because this is not actually a new performance of Peter Cushing as Grand Moff Tarkin, or Harold Ramis as Egon. It's just a very sophisticated version of the cardboard cutout in Game of Death. And yes, you could say the same about this, but this is only a tool that is used fairly sparingly and goes hand in hand with a performance that the actor already gave. While in this case, there is still something of the real actor's acting talent and skill on screen, even if the context of that performance has been changed. But this totally devalues the work of the original actor because it's essentially saying that there is no talent or skill involved in acting beyond what the actor looks like. It's saying that acting is not about the decisions an actor makes and how they deliver a line, how they interpret the character, how they interact with the other performers and so on. Nope, none of that matters. So long as you look the same, you'll do just fine. Governor Tarkin isn't iconic because of all the sinister menace Peter Cushing brought to the character. Nope, it's just because he looks like Peter Cushing. It may not surprise you to learn that since his death, a lot of people have been trying to recreate Robin Williams' likeness by using similar technology, and this was something the actor took steps to prevent in his lifetime, and in a recent Instagram post, his daughter articulated why she finds this technology so disrespectful. Living actors deserve a chance to create characters with their choices, to voice cartoons, to put their human effort and time into the pursuit of performance. These recreations are, at their very best, a poor facsimile of greater people, but at their worst, a horrendous Frankensteinian monster cobbled together from the worst bits of everything this industry is instead of what it should stand for. And besides totally diminishing the work an actor does to bring a character like this to life, there's also a more fundamental problem here, which is that there's not really any point to this. Like, just take a step back for a second and ask, what are you actually trying to achieve with this from a storytelling perspective? I mean, Rook being the same android model as Ash from the original Alien adds absolutely nothing to the story besides making us go, hey, it looks like Ash. The only plausible answer that I can think of is to preserve the in-universe continuity by making sure that this Tarkin looks the same as 1977's Tarkin. But you know that's just a gimmick, right? Like, we see it for the first time and go, oh, it's Peter Cushing, and then we just settle back into the movie again and kind of forget all about it. And this is why it doesn't matter how convincing the effect is, because no matter how realistic it is still just a circus trick that works exactly once before becoming totally pointless to the wider story you're trying to tell. Because preserving in-universe continuity to the point of obsession like this doesn't actually serve the wider story. In fact, what it ends up doing is hurting the universe because you can't do anything new with these characters. You can only have them doing the same thing over and over again.
You may fire when ready.
If you want to tell a genuinely new story with old characters after the original actor has died, then the solution is simple, and it's the same one it always has been. Just recast them. Because just like the gimmick with the deepfake, there's a brief moment where the audiences go, oh right, I guess that's Rhodey now. And then they just stop noticing it and go back to enjoying the story. So why is it that we're suddenly fretting so much about preserving continuity by resurrecting dead actors and trying to preserve their version of the character indefinitely? It's a solution to a problem that never existed. Ewan McGregor is more famous as Obi-Wan Kenobi than Alec Guinness, and one of the reasons for that was that casting a real actor who could bring his acting talent to the role allowed the character to grow and evolve beyond what we saw in the original trilogy. But they couldn't do anything meaningful with Leia in Rise of Skywalker because they were trapped using a previous version of the character, and that is why she felt so out of place in that movie. Another example of this being done really well is Karl Urban's portrayal of Dr. McCoy in the new Star Trek movies. It's a captivating performance because somehow it manages to capture everything DeForest Kelley brought to the role, and yet it still feels genuine and human, and over the course of the trilogy, it allowed Karl Urban's version of the character to evolve in his own way. But on the other hand, recasting also gives you the freedom to go a completely different direction with the character. When Richard Harris died and Michael Gambon took over as Dumbledore, he reinterpreted the character away from the softly spoken, slightly ethereal version Harris played and into this guy.
Harry, you put your name in the goblet of fire.
Do you think the Harry Potter series would have been as successful as it was for the next 6 movies if they had just used a CGI Richard Harris for all of them? Audiences have seen the live-action Batman recast 7 times. We've seen 6 James Bonds, 5 Catwoman, 4 movie Supermen, 3 Peter Parkers, 2 Obi-Wans, and, well,
there's only been one Blade.
Time and time again, iconic performances of beloved characters have been recast, and audiences accept this, and in most cases, embrace the new interpretation in a way that they never have, and probably never will, something like this. And it's kind of frustrating because from the looks of it, Guy Henry actually gave a pretty good performance as Grand Moff Tarkin. But we're not talking about that, we're talking about how convincing the CGI was. Because unlike this sort of thing, which is designed to capture an actor's underlying performance and convert it into an inhuman character, this was designed to replace Henry's performance with a digital mask, and in doing so, it devalued both the acting work of Henry himself and of Peter Cushing. No one would have cared if Grand Moff Tarkin was played by another actor in Rogue One, just like no one cared that this very same movie features Genevieve O'Reilly's Mon Mothma, a character that first appeared played by another actor in the original trilogy, like Grand Moff Tarkin. Now, O'Reilly first played her in Revenge of the Sith, but the recasting has allowed the character to reappear not just in Rogue One, but as a lead in the best show Star Wars has ever produced. But instead of just casting Guy Henry as Grand Moff Tarkin, instead they decided to do this, leaving the character recycling his greatest hits instead of growing and evolving like all of these characters were able to do. Finally, and it kind of goes without saying, but recasting gives a clear separation between one actor's portrayal of a character and another's. Whether or not the new one is better or worse, audiences clearly understand that a distinction is being drawn between this and the original. But as soon as you do this, then you blur those lines in a way that leaves a bad taste in the mouth. Coming back to Bruce Lee, this is why him being played by an actor in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is fine as far as the Malcolm score is concerned. Because this never claims to be Bruce Lee in the way that the Johnny Walker advert does, or Game of Death did for that matter. This is Mike Moe as Bruce Lee, not Bruce Lee himself, and that is the easiest way to separate the character from the real person. We see the same thing in biopics. Do you think Oppenheimer would have been better if there was a digital Oppenheimer covering up Cillian Murphy's performance? Of course not, because whether or not we believe this is Oppenheimer has nothing to do with whether or not he looks like Oppenheimer, just like whether or not we believe this is Obi-Wan has nothing to do with whether or not he looks like Alec Guinness. Characters come from the quality of an actor's performance, not from how much they look like the person they are portraying, and for that reason, we should continue to push back on attempts to gaslight us into thinking that this is a more faithful recreation of a character than this is. Cinema history has shown us time and again what is possible when you basically let the dead rest in peace. You can completely reinvent the character, or you can give a performance that tries to be as faithful as possible to the original version. In some cases, you can do both, but in every case, it opens up a world of possibilities far greater than you could possibly achieve if you remain stuck in the past by just trying to copy something else. But there is one final frontier of the Malcolm measure that we haven't looked at yet. Because believe it or not, there are cases that go beyond even this in the scales of creepiness.
Years from now, years and years, I'll be back.
A few months before Bruce Lee's Johnny Walker advert, Galaxy Chocolate did the same thing with Audrey Hepburn. This was done in a similar way to Peter Cushing in Rogue One, with a body double giving a physical performance and a digital copy of Hepburn's head put on top. So let's look at the Malcolm score. Well, Audrey Hepburn had been dead for over 20 years when this was made, but unlike all of these cases, she never even appeared as this character in her lifetime. This isn't Holly from Breakfast at Tiffany's or Anne from Roman Holiday, it's just woman on bus who happens to look like Audrey Hepburn. So obviously she never agreed to do this in her lifetime, but her family did give permission. Finally, this whole thing is totally digital, giving us a total Malcolm score of 19 and pushing us into the absolutely not, no one wants this bracket at the far end of the Malcolm measure. So just like these are creepier than these because you're not using any work the actor had done in their lifetime, this is another tier of creepiness because there is nothing of the real Audrey Hepburn in this. At least in these cases, the character is still based on previous work the actor had done in their lifetime. But this? There is absolutely nothing genuine about this, and like with these guys, it totally devalues Audrey Hepburn's acting talent and her legacy by reducing her to what she looks like. And that is why both the Hepburn advert and the Bruce Lee one have Malcolm scores of 19. Except these examples actually have Malcolm scores of 20 because we add an extra point if the project is an advert. And we do this because actors do adverts for money, not because of some deep artistic commitment to the project. I mean, sure, they do other acting work for money too, but generally that is not the only reason they do it. Like Paul Walker appeared as Brian because he liked these movies and enjoyed making them. Christopher Lee appeared as Saruman because he was a lifelong Tolkien fan. Yes, they got paid for those appearances, but that is not the only reason they did it. But Chris Hemsworth did this advert because of the paycheck, not because he has some deep emotional connection to Boss. So the reason the project being an advert adds a point to the Malcolm measure is because in all of these cases, you could at least make the argument that there was an underlying storytelling purpose to using the actor's likeness. As we've already seen, I don't think that's a very compelling argument, but it's an argument that you could make. But in the case of an advert, the only motive for this is money, which means the only reason Audrey Hepburn's estate agreed to this was to profit off her legacy. And I said earlier that it's not our place to question the motives of the late actor's family in agreeing to the use of their likeness, and I stand by that. But in the specific case of making an advertisement, I find it hard to see any other motivation. I don't know, maybe Audrey Hepburn was just super passionate about Galaxy Chocolate, but not enough to actually appear in an ad for the product in her lifetime, but I find that hard to believe. So that is why the project being an advert adds an extra point to the Malcolm score, giving both of these adverts pretty much the highest possible score. In fact, the only way the score could be higher would be if their families didn't give permission, for a maximum possible score of 25. And as far as I can tell from my research, this has only really happened once or twice, most recently when The Flash brought back Christopher Reeves' Superman without his family's sign-off, earning it a Malcolm score of 19. But this seems to be the exception, not the rule, and in the cases we've looked at so far, the production had the permission of the actor's estate to use their likeness. But at the rate things are going, I think it's only a matter of time before a dead actor's likeness is once again used in a project without permission. I mean, just earlier this year, OpenAI released a chatbot demo that appeared to be using Scarlett Johansson's voice without her permission. Now, they deny this was their intention, and they want us to believe that they completely accidentally created an AI chatbot that happens to have an eerily similar voice to the AI chatbot from a movie about an AI chatbot played by Scarlett Johansson. Anyway, they took the demo down, but it doesn't take much imagination to draw a line from that to the AI resurrection of an actor without their family's permission. And this is becoming more likely than you might think. I know I said I wouldn't talk about the legal side, but it is relevant here because, in California at least, the publicity rights to an actor's likeness end 70 years after their death, effectively meaning that their likeness comes into the public domain. And do you know which pop culture icon and hugely famous actor died 69 years and 9 months ago?
You're tearing me apart!
Yep, 2025 marks the 70th anniversary of James Dean's death, and wouldn't you know it, he has been cast in the movie Back to Eden, which will use an AI model of the actor. Now, this project is being supported by the people who own the rights to Dean's likeness, which just so happens to be a company specifically founded to represent dead celebrities. And even though Back to Eden is in fact the second time that they've tried to get AI James Dean off the ground, I don't think it's a coincidence that they're pushing ahead with a new project next year, because according to a Wired article from 2019, the company might lose the rights to Dean's likeness once the 70 years has passed, unless the actor has an identity that is being commercialized, such as their estate selling products and services associated with them. If that's the case, then that person's identity could continue to be protected under US trademark and unfair competition law. So call me cynical, but it seems that the reason for making Back to Eden is not so much because the filmmakers think it will be a fantastic way to honor the legacy of James Dean, or because they think AI James Dean would be the perfect leading man for this story instead of literally any human actor, but instead it's to make a project that will get the company a bunch of free advertising in the form of articles like this one, and to protect the legal right of that company to continue profiting off James Dean's likeness. But whatever the reason behind Back to Eden, it highlights the fact that not every dead actor will have the rights to their image held in perpetuity, meaning sooner or later we'll be seeing a lot more shit like this. And that feels pretty uncomfortable for all the reasons we've talked about in this video, but ultimately it's because there will be absolutely nothing of the real James Dean in this. Just like these examples, Back to Eden will be a completely soulless collection of pixels that is neither recreating something Dean himself did in his lifetime, nor serving any storytelling purpose whatsoever. And this is why I made the Malcolm measure, because so much of this conversation just focuses on the technology, but I think it's far more important to focus on the intention of the project. Finishing an actor's final performance immediately after their death is completely different from creating a digital clone 2 decades after someone's death to sell chocolate, and the whole point of the Malcolm measure is to highlight how stupid it is that we tend to talk about these examples as if they're the same thing. They're not, and yes, some of this has to do with technology, but mostly it has to do with the fact that in pretty much every circumstance, there is very, very little point from a storytelling, artistic, or even just practical perspective in bringing a dead actor back to life. Rise of Skywalker did not need to bring back Carrie Fisher. Rogue One did not need to bring back Peter Cushing. The Flash did not need Christopher Reeve, and Galaxy Chocolate absolutely did not need Audrey Hepburn to make this advert. At best, this is just a cheap gimmick to give audiences a tiny flash of nostalgia instead of giving them the chance to connect with something new like they have done time and time and time again. But at worst, it's a completely soulless attempt to profit off the likeness of a dead person in a way that shows a complete lack of creativity, imagination, and artistic respect for the actor, their craft, and their legacy. Because when you bring it back to basics, the only difference between this and the cardboard cutout of Bruce Lee's face 50 years ago is the fact that this looks a bit more convincing, but that doesn't make it any more justified. Because it is not and never will be a genuinely new performance by that actor. It will only ever be a very sophisticated copy, and so it will never feel genuine. All this does, from a creative and storytelling point of view, is stop progress. Rather than bringing in new stars and new characters, instead are we destined to just regurgitate the stars and characters of yesteryear forever? It sure seems that's what the studios want. Hell, apparently they don't even need to be dead for us to do it. Actually, you know what? That's not entirely fair because Robert Downey Jr. has in fact explicitly said that his estate will sue anyone trying to recreate his likeness after his death. And like we saw with Robin Williams, he's not the only actor taking steps in his lifetime to protect his posthumous image. Anyway, the point is that as impressive as this technology is, if the only thing you can think to do with it is to resurrect long dead actors, well, that is the absolute antithesis to progress and creativity. I don't have a problem with James L. Jones agreeing to let Disney use an AI version of his Darth Vader voice in perpetuity. That is a decision he is entitled to make. No, what I have a problem with is the fact that having that option now means Disney doesn't need to bother create the next Darth Vader. Why go to all the effort of creating a brand new iconic Star Wars villain when instead we can just have Darth Vader come back time and time and time again? Although, now that I think about it, maybe the signs have always been there.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Creativity thrives when it has restrictions and limitations. Like the reason they invented the teleport in Star Trek was because the show didn't have the budget to show a landing craft coming down to an alien planet in every episode. The TARDIS in Doctor Who looks like this for the same reason. They couldn't afford to make an actual spaceship, so they came up with something that went on to become one of the most iconic images in science fiction. And keeping with Doctor Who, when the lead actor decided to retire, what did they do? They recast him and came up with the concept of regeneration, providing an in-universe explanation for it that allowed the series to continue thriving and evolving for another 6 decades and counting. And after the actor who played the first Doctor passed away, they still brought his character back by, you guessed it, recasting him. First with his son, and more recently with David Bradley. And his scenes in the show work far more effectively than when they try and use old footage of the dead actors, because you can actually tell a new story with him because you have a real actor, you know, acting. Having the ability to recreate a dead actor is not a blessing, it's a curse, because all it will do is limit creativity and stand in the way of new actors telling new stories. I hope that what I have shown with this video and with the Malcolm measure is that except in a very narrow set of circumstances, we should let the dead rest in peace. Just because we can bring them back doesn't mean that we should, because progress does not come from repetition, it comes from regeneration. You might have noticed that this video has no sponsor, and that's because my fantastic patrons allow me to make videos like this one without having to break them up with an annoying ad read. There's heaps of great stuff over on the Patreon, like bonus videos and behind the scenes commentaries, and as a Christmas present, if you use the code MALCOLM on a $4 tier or higher, then you'll get your first month discounted by 50%. So feel free to check that out, or just subscribe if you liked the video. Thanks again to my patrons, and thank you for watching. See you next time.